Hi, everyone, and welcome to Get Hired Live. I'm Andrew Seaman, the LinkedIn news editor for job search and careers. I also do the Get Hired newsletter, which comes out on Mondays. So I just want to welcome you to the broadcast as always. And like always, I want to start by asking you to introduce yourselves in the comments. I've already seen a lot of you doing that. I've seen people from Canada, from Toronto specifically, London and Miami and all over. So be sure to introduce yourself in the comments. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you're looking for in the job market, where you're looking. And then what I want you to do is network with each other. Networking is so important to a job search that it's really important to always be making connections and building relationships. So if you haven't been doing that, now's a great time to start. So look into the comments and say, maybe you see someone who is looking for work in the area that you had worked in, or maybe they work in the area that you want to work in. And it's great to just reach out and say, hey, do you want to connect? Do you want to share some tips or maybe some leads that you may have in the job market? It's a great time to build those connections. So make sure you're doing that in the comments. And then obviously we'll be taking your questions about job searching. So get those into the comments as well. And we have a great guest today that we're going to be talking all about job searching. So I want to introduce him. His name is Tristan Layfield, and he's the owner and head career coach at Layfield Resume Consulting. So welcome, Tristan.
Hello, Andrew. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And, before we get started, I want to welcome some of the people who are in the stream. We have Courtney from Chicago, Katie from New York City, Sebastian from Delaware, Kevin from LA, and Carla from Atlanta. So we have people from all over, and you're coming to us from the Midwest and sort of the Metro Detroit area. So welcome. And I hope we can start by talking a little bit about a topic that I know you're passionate about, which is personal advocacy. So can you tell me a little bit about what personal advocacy is related to job searching?
Yeah, so personal advocacy, also known as self-advocacy, is essentially effectively sharing with others what you've already accomplished so that you can advance your career, right? It's about being your own biggest cheerleader and making sure that you understand what you've done previously and how that can help you get to where you're trying to go now, right? And so it's about using your voice and really making sure that you're conveying that in an appropriate manner. That's really what it comes down to when it comes to your job search.
That's great. And yeah, and I think there's so many different areas to be advocates for yourself in your daily life. And I guess, when it comes to a job search specifically, how do you do that? Can you give us some examples about day-to-day advocacy in your job search?
Yeah, so I think to do that, a couple of things that you need to do. The first thing is you need to identify your professional strengths, right? You need to understand where you actually make a difference, where you are really good at certain things. And then you need to understand how that fits into the company or companies that you want to work for, right? The whole point is that we need to be able to tie that in so we can successfully communicate your unique value proposition to those potential employers. So, what that can look like. It's number one, first, reflecting on your experience. I find oftentimes that a lot of job seekers have not taken enough time to reflect on their previous experiences to really understand what they did, what results they've driven, and how that impact the business, right? And that's really what we want to then be able to convey when we get to our resume. So when we do reflect on our experience, that gives us a plethora of things that we're able to do. We're then able to package up our relevant skills and results and value inside of our resume. We're able to connect the dots in our cover letters, right? Making sure that we're actually telling a story that ties into the company's missions, values, or goals, and also highlights our strengths. We're able to also paint better pictures during our interview. We're able to get some of those story banks of answers, right? The examples from our past experience, and we're able to paint the picture of how we are the best candidate for that role. And then I think one of the things that most people would appreciate is that now you know your value and you're able to better negotiate for salary and compensation that is adequate for the value that you're bringing to those roles. So there's tons of different ways that you're able to do that. It's, like I said, the resume, the cover letter, the interviews, and negotiating for your salary.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice. And I think a lot of it sounds like comes down to being a person who recognizes the value of push communication over passive communication, where,
Yep.
especially when you're a job seeker, I think a lot of people expect things to come to them. but in
Mhm.
reality, you have to put yourself out there, and you really have to get your materials yourself in front of the people who can give you those opportunities. So it's almost like, I know my worth, I know my accomplishments, and I need to go out and tell people what I can do for them, right?
Yep, exactly. But a lot of people struggle with that because we've often heard that advocating for yourself too much or talking too much about yourself or the things that you've done is sort of a faux pas, right? But I always tell people you want to own your ambition, especially if you're willing to put in the work to achieve your goals, right? Humility and knowing your worth aren't mutually exclusive. So, if the company or organization that you're going for doesn't appreciate that, then maybe it's just time to find a different company or organization. But understand that you have to be your own best advocate throughout your entire job search. No one else will be.
Yes, I think that's a fantastic way to put it. And like I said, that applies to so many areas of life, but it's especially important during a job search to do that.
Yeah.
And and let's get to some member questions, because we have people joining this stream and entering their questions. And if you're out there and you would like to ask a question, be sure to put it into the comments section. And if you're just joining us, this is Get Hired Live. I'm Andrew Seaman from LinkedIn News, and we have Tristan Layfield, who is the owner and head career coach of Layfield Resume Consulting. So let's get to some of those questions. I think one of the ones that comes up quite a bit, and we have two here about ageism. So it's probably good that we tackle this early on. What is, for someone who's older in the job market and maybe very self-conscious going into, say, I'm 50, I'm 60, they're going to hold that against me. What
Mhm.
should an older job seeker do during the job search to reduce the risk of ageism and also to maybe help their mindset?
Yeah, so to reduce the risk, there's a couple of things that oftentimes people can do. Number one is removing the dates from certain education, right? So some people like to utilize education dates as a way to calculate your age. So that's something that can help mitigate that risk there. It's also looking at older experiences and asking yourself, are there skill sets represented here that aren't already represented by more recent roles? Because if it's in more recent roles, then you may be able to roll off some of that older experience that can really help mitigate the risk that you have when it comes to people trying to calculate your age and how long you've been inside of the workforce. But the other thing is that you have to sort of recognize that your longevity inside of the workforce is actually an asset. And any company that sees it otherwise may just not be the right fit for you. And that's okay. But there is going to be a company that values the fact that you have, you're seasoned inside of the workforce, that you have the skills, you have the abilities, that you had the track record of actually, going into companies and working there and having longevity with them. And so I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, though some people may want someone who's a little bit younger. They may actually, be slightly ageist in that fashion, but you just have to sort of lean into it and understand they're going to find out one way or the other, right? Whether it be through a virtual interview, whether it be through an in-person interview. So you might as well just lean on it as a strength and really incorporate that into sort of your story that you tell the employer through your resume, cover letter, and your interview.
That's really great advice. And I think, the idea of flipping it to know that it's a strength and not necessarily a weakness is really important, because if you view your experience and your age as a strength, it can also flip the interview or any discussions you have where, they may read your insecurity or your worry about your age, and that will translate into the interview and discussion. So I think, flipping that into a strength is fantastic.
Yep.
And I know Eric asked about sort of the older age of the spectrum. That was a question from Eric, but we also have a question here from Alexandra, and that is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum.
Mhm.
So she's basically wondering, do candidates in their 20s also experience ageism? And also, how should a younger candidate combat that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think people on both ends of the spectrum absolutely experience ageism. What we often see on the younger end of the spectrum is people saying, "Oh, you don't have enough experience, or you haven't had enough time within the workforce." And so, with that, really the only way to combat that is to find a company or organization that's going to give you the chance to gain that experience. And then also think outside the box to find opportunities to continually gain experience, right? So let's just say you want to go into marketing and you're having a really hard time getting into some of these corporations that to do marketing for them. Then maybe it's thinking about, okay, there's a lot of people out here starting businesses or having small businesses that actually need somebody to help them with their marketing plans. So maybe thinking outside the box and reaching out to some of the entrepreneurs and setting up some type of contracting experience, so that way you can add more experience to your resume and sort of combat that idea that you aren't experienced enough. The other thing that happens with a lot of younger job seekers is they tend to job hop, right? It started with millennials and it's still happening with Gen Z. And some people, that used to be a lot more taboo. It's becoming a little bit more commonplace, and so people aren't necessarily looking at that as much. But if someone is worried about the fact that you're 20 and you've had like 2 or 3 jobs, then it's sort of similar to what I said earlier about the person who's a little bit older. Sometimes it's about leaning into that as a strength, right? Maybe those 3 jobs were in different industries, so you have a broader range of knowledge and experience inside of the field, right? So it's really figuring out how you're able to frame that to make sure that it plays more so in your favor rather than it being detrimental for you.
Definitely. And I think one of the things, especially for younger candidates, is that many times, especially people who are fresh out of college, the hiring manager and everyone else will underestimate you. So even if you're in a position that you aren't in love with, you can really exceed in those positions because people, because of your age, will underestimate your abilities. And I think that's a great way to prove yourself and really impress everyone kind of in your company.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, half the battle when it comes to the job search is also your mindset. Sometimes we end up imposing our own thoughts on the people that we're interviewing with. And it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at times. There can be times where the hiring manager wasn't even thinking about your age, but you're the one that's so worried about it that you make it a thing, right? So we also just need to be very well aware of our mindset and how we're framing it, because that can often impact our experience.
Yeah. And you mentioned sort of resume structure in both of those answers, and we have some resume questions here. And this one's from Christian. What do you believe is the optimal structure for a resume? What format or headlines will help you break through the clutter and get noticed at first glance by recruiters? I think everyone wants to sort of stand out in a crowd. So what's the best way to do that on resume?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways to do this. I think the best format at this point in time is sort of a 1-column format, right? Top to bottom, simply because we have to get past the applicant tracking software. So for people who don't know about applicant tracking software or applicant tracking systems, about 70% of companies and organizations use them. About 95% of Fortune 500 companies use them. And basically they're systems systems that scan through your resume and application looking for keywords and phrases. And if you do not have the right keywords and phrases, oftentimes you're sort of thrown in the no pile before it's ever seen by a human, right? So we want to make sure that our formatting structure is set up in a way that allows it to go through that applicant tracking system, okay? The next thing is that we want to have clear and defined headers, right? So you clearly want to call out experience. You clearly want to call out education. You clearly want to call out skills or expertise if you have that type of section. We want to make sure that that is clear and defined. Another thing is, don't be afraid to incorporate color, but be sure to, pull back the reins a little bit, right? We don't want to go overboard. A small bit of color goes a long way. We also want to be mindful of the colors that we incorporate, right? We don't want to do fluorescent pink, right? And we want to do something in the blues and the greens, maybe even slightly getting into, maybe some reds or purples and deep purples inside of there. But we don't want to do anything excessive inside of that. That is one thing that helps you stand out. I've reviewed almost 2,000 resumes. Only about 50 have ever come to me already with color in the document, and those have automatically stand out from the rest of them, right? And one of the tactics that I've also find, we love these designer resumes, templates that are out there, but oftentimes they get caught up in the applicant tracking system. So what I tell people is have one that you utilize to actually apply with, and then have another one that you can send, before the interview or bring with you in the interview as sort of a piece that impresses them, right? Something that's a little bit more formatted if you want to go down that route. But it's definitely about having that one column format, about having those defined headers for each one of the sections. I also like to incorporate a skills or expertise section that focuses on hard, tangible skill sets, right? Like project management, marketing strategy, or trend analysis, things like that, hard, tangible skills, rather than the soft skills. Those are the things that are going to help you hit on some of those keywords inside of the resume. And it's nice to be able to play around with some of those to help you get past that applicant tracking system.
I think that's all great advice. And, when it comes to designs too, it's so important to explain what they are, because I remember the one time I was involved with a hiring decision and I looked at a resume and there were all these charts on the resume, but none of them made sense and none of them were explained. So we just basically automatically rejected that because, if they're going to submit a resume with all these different graphs and charts on, but not explain what they are, it doesn't show a good communication skill. And then also something you mentioned, the applicant tracking system, something that I always recommend to people is that you actually read everything as you're applying. So if it says a yes or no question or check a box or something like that, you're going to want to make sure you're very thorough when applying like that, because otherwise you could hit no by accident and it may automatically reject your application because you don't meet a qualification or something. So it's important to read everything when you're applying. And as a follow-up, I think, it's the sort of unspoken brother of the resume, which is the cover letter. And we have some people who are asking, basically, what are your thoughts on the value of a cover letter? That's from Doug. And Steve is asking, is a cover letter really necessary these days?
So is a cover letter really necessary? Let's start there. So if a job doesn't say it's required, then no, it's not absolutely necessary. What I tell people is oftentimes what we hear is that most people aren't submitting cover letters. So it can be a tactic to help you stand out a bit. Just because everyone else isn't doing it doesn't mean that you shouldn't. And you always want to be mindful of this. I tell people that a well-written, well-tailored cover letter can never hurt. But a generic one or one that's poorly written can be completely detrimental to your entire job search, right? So we want to be mindful when we're writing cover letters. I like to tell a story, and it's about tying in your experience, the results, the values that you've driven, and sort of what you want to do with the mission, values, or goals of the organization. When people are trying to hire you, they're hiring people to solve a problem. And the cover letter can be a great way to sort of tell the story of how all of your experience culminates in you being the solution to that problem. So I think that's really where people struggle, right? They tend to regurgitate their resume on their cover letter rather than sort of, using it as a space to sort of connect the dots and tell that story. So really for me, I think it is a nice tool to have, but you always want to be mindful that cover letters should absolutely be tailored to every single role that you're applying to. You do not want to send out a generic cover letter. That's just simply not going to work. That's sort of what my stance is. Is it required? No, but I think it can be a great tactic to help you stand out if it's well written and well tailored.
And actually, I just wrote about cover letters in my newsletter. And what was really fascinating is I started digging into a little bit of the history of the cover letter, and a lot of the terms in terms of what a cover letter is called. There was a financial disclosure term called cover letter in the 1930s that accompanied raw data. So when a bank or something was sending data to another institution, they would include a cover letter. And it basically said, we have the raw data, but here's the story behind the data in the cover letter. So it was almost like you said, filling in those gaps and painting a picture of what the data represented. And obviously that got translated to careers and job search, and is still serving that purpose today. So it's sort of like, think of that as filling the gaps that your resume isn't showing, which I think is a great historical idea. And when it comes to a job search, networking is really important. And we have a question here from Terry, and it's a really great question. How do I decide which people to connect with at a company I want to work at? We always talk about target companies, we talk about networking with people, but how do you actually decide who you should reach out to?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think this is sort of the starting point of figuring out where to network, or how to network. And I think really what you want to look at is you want to. There's two types of people that I tell people to keep their eyes out for. It's people who are in positions that are similar to the one that you want to actually get, right? So people who currently hold those titles are in the same department as people who hold those titles. And then you want to look at people who are 1 to 2 levels above where you want to be. Those are the people that are the decision makers, right? So we really want to try to connect with them, especially utilizing platforms like LinkedIn, connecting with people who already hold the title or in the department that you want to work in and that are 1 to 2 levels above where you want to be. That allows you to curate your connections list, which means that your timeline and your feed is going to be filled with those type of people. And when you interact and engage with them, you actually are making yourself much more known. They're more likely to actually come to your page and sort of see who you are and what you're about. And as they get more comfortable and start interacting with you, now their connections are also seeing those interactions. So I always say you want to look at people who hold those titles that you want to have, are in the departments where you want to be, and that are 1 to 2 levels above where you want to go. Those are the key targets, people that you really want to connect with, to try and make sure that you gain more insight and maybe even potentially gain a referral.
Yes, definitely. And I think another thing to think of is, even if it's not a target company, people in those positions at competitors, because a lot of times there's people who have sort of jumped ship from one competitor to another. So I
Mhm.
find that if you discuss with people who maybe it's not the target company, but it's like a cousin of the target company, that
Mhm.
you could really find good connections and good networks that way too. So it's almost like,
Absolutely.
you're not risking sort of offending someone at your target company, but you're also getting insight into that world at a competitor, which is also a great advantage in the job market.
Yeah.
And we have some more resume questions coming in, and we have people who are basically saying, what if you don't have a lot of experience to put on your resume? So Ashley says, how can we show lack of experience in young age as a strength? And also, this is from Ejo, what are good resumes for those who have light experience or little to none?
Yeah, so I think it's less about focusing on the actual resume. I think resumes for the most part are they're fairly similar, fairly standard. They have them for different levels, but it's more about focusing on gaining experience where you can, right? Where can you volunteer to gain more experience in the area you want to get into? Volunteer experience, though it may not be paid, is still experience, right? Like I said earlier, it's thinking outside the box. Maybe it's working with certain entrepreneurs, and helping them in certain areas to gain more experience. Maybe it's going on to different platforms like Upwork and Fiverr and seeing what type of things you can take on a contractual basis to gain more experience. But it's really about figuring out, how can I bolster my experiences on my resume, right? Your resume is a document where you convey your experiences. If you don't have the experiences, then unfortunately there's not a ton you can do there, right? But so you really need to focus on, how can I gain those experiences, and then how can I utilize the experience that I've gained to really showcase the value I provided, the results that I've provided. And I think that's really where the focus needs to be. There's only so much you can do if you do not have the experience. It's more about getting a plan together to figure out how you can gain some of that.
Yeah, and I think there's so many different ways. Like you said, there's a lot of sites that are, basically the gig economy, but
Mhm.
applied to your industry. And then obviously, I know that there's some objection to this, but volunteer experience is also great. If there's a nonprofit that you care deeply about, it's still experience and it's showing that your skills are sharp. So I always say, if there's a nonprofit in your backyard or something that you could do remotely, that's also something great that can fill a spot on your resume, even if it's unpaid, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can even look at strategic internships, right? Those are another way to gain experiences. Sometimes they may be unpaid, sometimes they may be, minimal pay, but it's a great way to sort of, set a foundation for where you're trying to go.
Yeah. And we have, and I think this is a little bit related, we have a lot of people in the stream who are asking about functional resumes, which I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, functional resumes are essentially highlighting skills over experience. And
Yeah.
it's, some people are saying hybrid resumes. What is your opinion on functional resumes? And also, how does that play with the applicant tracking system? Does it get kicked out, or how does it work?
Yeah, so this is a really good conversation. I think personally, from my conversations that I've had with HR and recruiting professionals, I don't often recommend functional resumes, simply because I know that a lot of recruiters and hiring managers, when they first see it, it sort of throws them off. It's not something that they're used to seeing, and that can sometimes be a good thing, but more often than not, it can be a bad thing. And inside of that, it starts to open up questions with functional resumes. People start to question, what are you trying to hide by doing this, right? So it opens you up to another level of scrutiny that I think you may not be thinking about when you're doing it, right? The very thing that you're trying to hide is going to be the very thing that you highlighted. So you really want to be mindful of that. And when it comes to applicant tracking systems, it can potentially throw you out of the system. The system can be a little bit confused by what's going on there, right? Because what you're leading with is you're leading with certain skills, and you're sort of putting bullet points under there. But the applicant tracking system is looking for that title, they're looking for that company, they're looking for the dates you worked there, and things get a little bit jumbled when it comes to the functional resume when that system is scanning. So it's not something that I often recommend. And if we're going to utilize it, most times I find that it's best to utilize when we're actually directly providing our resume to someone, right? If they provide an email for you to send it in, or you're going to be handing it directly to someone. But oftentimes I would advise against that and stay with a fairly standard reverse chronological resume, just simply off the conversations that I've had with recruiters and hiring managers.
Yes, and I'm so happy you sort of made that distinction of applying through an online service that'll go through the ATS almost as a guarantee. And
Mhm.
then there is the in-person handoff, which I think is incredibly valuable and also an opportunity to sort of mix things up. So I think,
Mhm.
those distinctions are fantastic.
Thank you.
And we had a question here. This is also something that's been really big lately, ghosting. This is a question from Andrea.
Mhm.
And basically, she says the new trend in the job search. What are your thoughts on this phenomenon? That's from Andrea. And I guess, Andrea, the first thing I should say, I'll jump in first, is that this isn't a new trend, unfortunately. It's probably happening a little bit more frequently because the power dynamic has changed so much. But it's definitely something that has been around. It's just there are so many job seekers right now. It's probably more prevalent. What are your thoughts on it, Tristan?
Yeah, I hate ghosting on both ends, from job seekers and from employers. It's funny because I'm actually going to be giving an entire presentation on this for a virtual HR summit, talking directly to recruiters and hiring managers about how they need to transition their practices from ghosting to providing feedback. I really think that ghosting is a sign of an employer that you may not necessarily want to work with, right? Typically, that means that they already were planning on hiring somebody internally. They already had the candidate externally that they knew they wanted. That they are on the fence about you, and they really didn't know how to make a decision. Maybe the hiring manager couldn't make a decision. So there's tons of different reasons why ghosting happens, but I really think it is a terrible thing to do on both ends. I think it's imperative for job seekers to always communicate, especially if you got another offer that you took, that's fine, but let the recruiter or hiring manager know that. Now on the other side, recruiters and hiring managers, I know they're scared to give feedback for certain reasons, right? They're scared of lawsuits, they're scared of creating or opening Pandora's box of problems that may arise for them. But what I think is really essential is for recruiters and hiring managers to understand that collectively, if they begin to give feedback to potential employees or people who are applying to jobs, it actually will benefit all companies, right? What happens is, let's just say I'm going to apply at Apple, and we're going through these interviews, and then I get some feedback, and they're like, we're not going to go with you, but these are the reasons why. These are some of the things that we think could help your application the next time. Now I go and I'm like, okay, I want to apply to Facebook. Now I have all of that feedback, and I'm able to go and implement that. But the reverse happens with the other company, right? Now I have if Facebook gave me feedback when I applied to them and I go to apply to this other company, we're getting better candidates, right? We're getting better people who are more equipped to actually convey their experience and actually conduct good interviews and start doing things better throughout the entire job search process. So I think that ghosting is a terrible thing. We should not be doing it on both ends, and employers certainly should not do it. I think it's something that speaks very much to their culture, very much to their image and brand, and we should make sure that we value job seekers' time just as much as they value yours.
Yeah, I think that is a great explanation. And also, two things that I would add is I think I get this a lot from job seekers is that just submitting an application, that's not ghosting. So a lot of people sometimes think ghosting involves I submitted an application, I never heard back. That's not actually ghosting. Ghosting is after you've had a conversation with the company, maybe they even brought you in for an interview or had you work on sort of a sample project, and then you never heard back, or you never heard back after like a third or fourth interview. So if you just submit an application, sometimes they're just so overwhelmed that they can't send you a personal note. I still think most employers should send you at least a form letter or something to say, hey, we've moved on. So that way it closes that loop for you.
Yes.
The other thing I would say is always be nice to the recruiter or hiring manager, even if they are ghosting you. And the reason I say this is because at LinkedIn, the reason I got this job way back when is that I didn't hear anything for a few weeks and I thought I had been ghosted, but it turned out things were just moving slowly. So if I sent maybe a letter or an email saying, how dare you not respond to my email in a week? It turns out that they were just busy and they they needed to work through some other stuff. And then next thing you know, I was hired. So that's how I got here. So you need to leave that door open. Otherwise, you might slam it shut and they were going to go through it in a few weeks. So things may move slowly and they may not be in a position to sort of respond to you immediately. People may be on vacation. So even if you think you're being ghosted, be nice because it may pay off in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And be nice just because you might want to come back to this company and apply again down the line, right? You never know what type of notes they're putting in the system if you are someone who's pretty rude throughout the process. So
Yeah, and it may just be a bad recruiter that you have, and the next recruiter that you interact with, maybe on a different position, will be fantastic.
absolutely.
Yeah, and I guess we're basically out of time, but one more question that I wanted to get out of here is from Andrea, I think, which is basically how do you deal with fatigue during the job search? Obviously, a job search is really draining to a person. There's a lot of rejection, either overtly or implied, and sometimes it can stretch 3-4 months, even to a year. How do you suggest people keep up their motivation, keep job searching?
Yeah, that's a really good question because job searching is a very tough process. I think first is making sure that you actually have a job search process, right? Oftentimes people get fatigued because they're just sort of shooting darts in the dark, right? They really don't have a plan to move forward. So number one, establish a plan. As things are progressing, if you're not hearing back, if you're having some issues, I often tell people take a little bit of time off from the job search, right? I'm not telling you, take a week or two, but take 1 or 2 days back to yourself. Do something that you love, right? Do something that takes your mind off of the entire job search. It's imperative that we take care of ourselves and that we provide the time for us to recoup and really make sure that we are, then ready to come back and hit the ground running. The other thing is if you're going months on end without actually landing a role, take some time to assess what your strategy is and if it's the right one. Maybe it's time to hire a career coach or resume writer, right? Maybe it's time to get a little bit of feedback from mentors, whatever the case may be, but you want to take some time to assess what's going on. So that way you can, regroup and get your bearing and actually start making progress, right? If it's gone on for a very long time, there's typically an issue that needs to be solved. But I can't stress enough, taking a little bit of time for yourself. We get so caught up because yes, we need to pay bills. Yes, we need to have the job. We need the insurance. But oftentimes we just will not give ourselves a break. So you need to give yourself some grace and give yourself some time to really recoup your energy and be able to come back to this job search stronger and better.
Yes, and I think, I think that's such wonderful advice. And I see in the comments one from Arlene about sort of rejections making her emotional.
Mm.
And I think, it's so common. And I think most people have been in that position. So even when you feel like, you're being rejected because of you, a lot of times there's variables outside your control that lead to the rejection. It might be, nepotism at play. It could be, they just had someone internally that applied and they got priority. So always make sure that you keep sort of that distance too, that those rejections aren't personal. There's just so many variables and you can never necessarily say it's because of X, Y, or Z. So thank you so much for your time, Tristan. This was wonderful. And I hope everyone follows you. On the bottom of the screen, we've been flashing your LinkedIn profile URL. So hopefully people will navigate there. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this. Thanks again.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you all for joining us on Get Hired Live. Coming up next week, I have Virginia Franco, who is a resume writer and storyteller. So she helps people tell their story to potential employers. So our producers will be dropping a link in the comments right now, or you could navigate to the post and find it right away and RSVP for next week. And also upcoming on the show here, not necessarily on Get Hired Live, but on Business Unusual, we have the CEO of Netflix, Reed Hastings, coming up next week on This Is Working. That's hosted by my boss's boss's boss, Dan Roth, who is our editor-in-chief at LinkedIn News, an incredible business journalist. And he'll be talking to probably one of the most important CEOs around Netflix, Reed Hastings, who's keeping everyone entertained during the pandemic. So be sure to tune in for that, and you could RSVP for that as well. And I hope to see you, like I said, here next week. And until then, please stay safe. Follow the health guidelines of your local government and health officials, because you could only get a job, you could only be a good candidate if you are well enough to do so. So be sure to do that. And then until next time, keep your chin up, keep going, and best of luck.